Alright, so when I was putting together this presentation, something happened in the news. I don't know if any of you were paying attention, but on Wednesday, the Israeli government came to a deal with Hamas to release Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit in exchange for a number of Palestinians that they'd been holding. And he has been in captivity for 5 years. This is not the first time that they've talked about a prisoner exchange, but it seems to have finally worked out. So think about that for a second. For 5 years, this man has been a prisoner of war. They've been trying to work out a deal to get him released, and it has finally happened. So why does this process take so long? And what does this have to do with the American Revolution? As long as people have been fighting wars, they've been taking prisoners. And as long as they've been taking prisoners, they've been trying to figure out ways to exchange those prisoners. Because a prisoner doesn't really do you much good sitting in prison. In fact, they're kind of a liability. They eat food, they require medical care, things like that. So by this point, by the mid-18th century, European armies have gotten pretty good at exchanging prisoners. There's this long-standing tradition, this set of rules that goes as far back as organized armies, and there's a very well-established system of trade based on rank. Equivalent ranks are traded one for one. There's a whole exchange system where this many majors are worth a colonel, and this many colonels are worth a major general, and all of that. So when you look at the American Revolution and you see these issues over prisoner exchanges, it presents a whole different situation, and the whole system starts to break down. And part of the reason for that is that we are existing in a gray area in terms of this guerrilla war that people like Francis Marion are carrying on, where they're kind of operating outside of the bounds of the rules of warfare that European soldiers are used to waging. And so who qualifies as a soldier, who qualifies as being of a certain rank, ends up being problematic. But the constraints of caring for prisoners are just as important, maybe more so. At this point, everyone, both on the American side and on the British side, are hurting for supplies. The British have this huge collection of American prisoners sitting in Charleston that they captured during the siege of Charleston, and supplies are tight. So you have the same kinds of impetus for getting rid of prisoners as quickly as possible. Both sides are wanting to get them off their hands. But things work out a little bit differently than they would in more of a European context. So I want to talk about one specific attempt at prisoner exchange that went awry. And for the research on this, I am once again, for those of you who saw me at Walterboro, I'm once again indebted to Dave Nealon for doing this work on Francis Marion. He is kind of the Francis Marion expert. If you want to know anything, look to Dave, and hopefully he'll be coming out with his edition of the Francis Marion papers. But this particular incident that I want to talk about occurs in the winter of 1781 after a particular raid in which Captain John Postel perpetrated upon the British at their base at Monk's Corner, and ends up taking 36 prisoners, 3 of them wounded. Brings them back into Marion's camp, and they combine them with another 29 men of the King's American Regiment who had been taken in a separate raid, and they're collected in Marion's base. So now we've got over 60 men, over 60 British soldiers, which is at this point a large percentage of the number of men that Marion has. He's sitting in the middle of a swamp. It doesn't have any regular supply lines. These guys are getting expensive to keep around. And so he writes a letter to Captain John Saunders of the Loyalist Queen's Rangers, and he says, Saunders writes to him, Being informed that several wounded prisoners taken by you at Monk's Corner are destitute of the proper medicines and necessaries, which I am told are not in your power to obtain for them, humanity therefore causes me to request that you would permit them to be sent in here or to any other of His Majesty's posts to remain till they may be sufficiently recovered. So Saunders is writing to him, hoping that perhaps these soldiers can be exchanged, or if not exchanged, at least they can be allowed to return to British lines temporarily for medical care. However, Marion has already sent these men on to Virginia. He doesn't have a surgeon, he doesn't have the medical or logistical resources to keep them there. So he sends them back up to Virginia, where there are the logistical resources to take care of them. He has the other 33, and he is willing to trade for them with the British. And he's willing to trade all 33 British prisoners for 4 Americans, which happen to be the number that Saunders has in his power. So this lopsided ratio kind of gives you an idea of just how badly Marion wanted these guys off his hands. Wants to quit feeding them, wants to quit taking care of them. And so he also floats the idea that perhaps in order to make it more of an even trade, the difference could be made up with some of the American Continentals that are being held in Charleston. Saunders is not interested in this partial exchange. He wants all of the soldiers. So this is the first conflict, the first roadblock that they run into. Saunders writes him back, if these guys are on their way to Virginia, ride up there and turn them around, because we want all of them. And we're not really interested in a partial trade. So a few days go by, Marion does end up getting these guys turned around, and he sends back to Saunders another proposal for now the full prisoner exchange. And he sends Captain Postel under a flag of truce to negotiate this. Well, Postel walks into camp under his flag of truce to arrange the prisoner exchange, and Saunders arrests him and throws him in jail. So why is this happening? It's kind of a surprise, not what you'd expect for someone coming in under a flag of truce to negotiate a prisoner exchange. And to understand this, we have to go back another 9 months to another letter, or a document, which reads, I do hereby acknowledge myself a prisoner of war upon my parole to His Excellency Sir Henry Clinton, and that I am thereby engaged, until I shall be exchanged or otherwise released therefrom, to remain at my plantation in the parish of St. Mark's, in the county of Craven, in the province of South Carolina, and that I shall not in them continue, do, or cause anything to be done prejudicial to the success of His Majesty's arms, or have intercourse or hold correspondence with his enemies, and that upon a summons from His Excellency or other person having authority, there so that I will surrender myself to him or them at such time and places as I shall hereafter be required. 19th day of May, 1780, John Postel. All right, so in May of 1780, Postel had signed this parole. Basically, he had been captured just outside of Charleston during the operations around Charleston surrounding the siege, and captured by the British, and the British could have put him on a prison ship with all those other Continentals that they were holding in the harbor, but again, it's another mouth to feed. Again, you see this incentive. And so the British response to this problem, since at this point the Americans didn't have very many British soldiers to exchange, their response was to issue these paroles. And basically what a parole says is that if you sign it, you go home, you basically retire from the war, you don't raise arms against the British again, and that's pretty much the end of it. As long as you agree to sit out the rest of the war and not fight against the British, then they're not worried about you anymore. Postel had signed this thing, and then he had gone to fight with Marion again. And as you can see from the very fact that they had gotten all these prisoners, he was very active in Marion's army. So here's this guy, right? He fought for the Americans, he was captured, he signed a document that said he wasn't going to fight anymore. He goes, he fights again, he leads this raid that actually captures all these British soldiers. And then when it comes time to exchange those soldiers, he walks into the British camp under a flag of truce expecting to negotiate, and Saunders did not think that that was the way that things were going to go down. So he ends up being thrown in prison. Marion sees it differently, and he writes to Saunders, by my orders, Lieutenant Colonel Irvin sent Captain Jean Postel with flag of truce to exchange the men that you agreed to, and I am greatly surprised to find you not only refused to make the exchange, but have violated my flag by taking Captain Postel prisoner, contrary to the laws of nations. So you understand where Saunders is coming from, but look at it from Marion's point of view, right? Everybody wants this prisoner exchange to happen. They've been working on it for all this period of time. They've finally gotten it to the point where it looks like it's going to happen. And he sends a guy to sign the papers, finalize the deal, and his guy ends up getting thrown in prison. So you can sort of see both sides of this argument, and you can see how it's sort of starting to break down. What you're seeing here is a lack of trust between the two sides. There are these sort of agreed upon rules and traditions of how prisoner exchanges are supposed to work, but the system is breaking down in this vacuum where the rules don't seem to apply, and neither side trusts the other to keep up their part of the bargain. So the next letter that Marion sends to Saunders informs him that Marion will also be sending a copy to Saunders' superior, Nisbet Balfour, which of course is the 18th century military equivalent of, I want to see your manager right now. So he sends this letter to Balfour explaining the situation and asks for redress. He's, however, still trying to work out this prisoner exchange, but the next letter that he sends to Saunders, it does come under a white flag, but this time it also comes with an armed escort. So these guys come in under a white flag, but a whole platoon of them come in with weapons in case the same thing happens again. Now this is completely a symbolic gesture. There's no chance that these 15 or 20 guys armed with muskets walking into the British camp were actually going to be able to protect themselves or the flag had it come to that. But it is also an important symbolic gesture here, right? Marion is saying that the British cannot be trusted to honor his flag. Obviously, this thing that's gone down before was a violation, and so this is further evidence that there's a complete breakdown of trust going on here. And he explains it. He says, the reason of it is that Captain Saunders, Commandant of Georgetown, has violated the laws of nations by detaining, taking, and imprisoning Captain Postel, who carried prisoners to exchange, which was agreed to by him. Right? Very explicit here. The reason that I'm sending these guys along with the flag is that you can't be trusted to treat the flag bearer as he deserves to be treated. Now, John Watson, who's another British officer in the area, somewhere in the chain of command between Balfour and Saunders, also gets involved in this. Presumably, he got a copy of one of the letters from Marion that went to either Saunders or Balfour, and he writes back to Marion, and Watson is he has a way with words. He's a colorful character, and he writes to Marion, "It is with less surprise that I find a letter sent by you in all the apparent forms of a flag of truce, attended by an armed party who concealed themselves within a certain distance of a place that pointed itself out for the delivery of it, than to see the contents of it exhibit a complaint from you against us for violating the laws of nations." So, full of sarcasm, basically, calling Marion a hypocrite, arguing that and this letter goes on, I'm not going to quote all of it, but it goes on to say, to list all these events in which Marion has violated the laws of nations, according to Watson. And that's sort of tangential to what we're talking about, but that's what I talked about last time in Walterboro, is this exchange between these guys about the treatment of prisoners. So this is all going on in the background, right? They both have this conception of the other as being cruel to prisoners, not treating them with with the dignity that they deserve, in some cases even abusing prisoners. And so all of this is feeding into the mistrust and the illegitimacy that each side views, the illegitimacy with which each side views the other. So at this point, Watson is pretty sick of Marion complaining about the laws of nations, because he's been doing it for months, and Watson is essentially just sick of hearing about it. And on top of that, Marion is holding these British soldiers in the middle of a swamp. There's no dignity to it, and it's certainly not befitting these men of His Majesty's army. And so Watson continues, and I just want to quote from this because Watson's language is just so fantastic, so flowery, and so indignant. He says, "I believe, sir, it would be as difficult for you to name an instance of a breach of it in His Majesty's troops as it would be for them to discover one where the law of arms or nations has been properly attended to by any of your party. An enumeration of the various particulars of such practices on your side would be needless. If your followers are composed of people who have broken their paroles, they must expect to suffer that punishment, which in opposition to the late cruelties exercised by those who say they belong to you, it becomes necessary for us to inflict, and which the law of nations justifies. The houses of desolate widows have been laid waste, even burnt by these people. By these people, too, many individuals defenseless, without arms, and taking side with neither contending party, but residing peaceably in their own houses, have been murdered. Does martial any more than civil law countenance such people? If ever they fall into our hands, they will meet with the punishment due to their crimes. When noble enemies make war, such men are protected by no side. You say it was agreed that an exchange of prisoners should take place at Georgetown, and that Captain Postel went with a flag for that purpose in consequence of that agreement? But I conceive it was not agreed that a man on parole to us should become our enemy. Men like His Majesty's troops, fighting from principle for the good of their country, with hearts full of conscious integrity, are fearless of any consequences." So, this is the way, obviously, that Watson views it. That Postel's parole violation is the only thing that matters. This man has broken his parole, and he came into British hands, however it is that he came into British hands, and now he deserves what's coming to him. So, this boils down here to a distinction between civilized soldiers and partisans, and this misunderstanding on either side of how the other views them. So for the British, these partisan soldiers are, in many cases, not, because they're not civilized soldiers, they're not accorded the same respect within the laws of nations that would entitle them to these prisoner exchanges occurring in a regular way. And for the Americans, they see this abuse the same way, that the British have violated this flag, they've done all these horrible things, and so at the end of the day, they just can't be trusted to be gentlemanly. So each side is basically looking at this as, why should we honor the laws of wars when you clearly don't? The other side clearly has violated this. Why should we be bound by it? And this, of course, leads to more infringements on both sides, and the whole thing just sort of spirals out of control to the point where these flags of truce, these white flags, mean absolutely nothing on either side. So Balfour agrees with Saunders and Watson that Marion has violated this agreement by sending Postel into the British camp. Postel should be a prisoner anyway, and so there's absolutely no reason that Saunders should have acted any differently. In fact, the only reason that Postel wasn't already a prisoner is British generosity, right? They were nice enough to let the guy go back to his farm, and he went right back to killing them. Maybe that's not completely fair, since the reasoning for it is not just generosity, but also frugality. They don't want him eating up any more of their food than he has to. And so Postel sort of becomes this symbol of how Americans are cheating the system disregarding the rules, not playing fair. They're just uncivilized people. And so Balfour writes back, "My wish is of rendering the situation of prisoners in all respects as little irksome as possible, and mitigating on all occasions the honors of war, perfectly coincide with those you express, and therefore this part of your letter gives me great hopes." Right? Now it's a settled issue. We fixed the deal with Postel. He's back in British custody where he belongs. Now we can move forward with this prisoner exchange. Send us someone who's not a criminal, and we'll talk to him about a prisoner exchange. But perhaps that was a little bit too optimistic, because the officer who was carrying this message to Marion, Marion takes into custody, throws him in prison, right? Even though he comes in under a white flag. Now, Marion doesn't try to justify this by saying that this guy was a criminal or that he had done anything wrong. It's simply retaliation for Postel. They're going to keep him as a hostage until the British agree to release their flag. And again, if you don't abide by the laws of war, why should we? And in fact, Balfour saw this coming. And he wrote to Saunders asking him not to send an officer, to send an NCO instead, because he was afraid that if Saunders sent an officer with the flag, Marion would do exactly what he did. But Saunders disregarded him. And so the next letter of complaint, which Saunders of course sends to Marion, asking him how he could possibly have done this, comes via, quote, "a little boy of John Witherspoon's." So this time they send the message with a child, figuring this is the only way they can guarantee that Marion's not going to violate the laws of war. And they also don't have to risk giving away any more hostages. So at this point, trust between the two sides has completely degenerated. These flags are meaningless. This attempt to organize this prisoner exchange that everybody wants keeps falling apart. We've been at it for 2 months now, trying to figure out how to make this thing work. But at the end of the day, in order to make it work, the two sides have to trust each other, and they clearly don't. So Marion writes back, "The violation of my flag is a good reason to believe it may a second time be done, and obliged me to act as I did. When my flag is released, I'll have faith and act in the usual way. If Captain Postel was a prisoner, it was no reason for the violation of my flag." So now we're at a complete breakdown. Now there is really no way that these people are going to sit down at a table and come to any kind of agreement. And so the deals end up getting more and more complicated, with each side wanting to see verification. That you release this many, and then we'll release this many, and once we've gotten these troops, then we can release these others. And it's perfectly encapsulated by this next letter that Watson writes to Marion that says, "General Sumter sent a flag to say if we would let him have 4 men, he would exchange 4 he had taken at Nelson's Ferry for them. 3 of those he sent for were killed, but we sent him 6 others and requested he would get from you, Thomas Wise, and another man if you had him. For the other 2 sent more than he had men to exchange for this. The flag took upon himself to answer for. If therefore you thought proper, I should be glad to have that Wise and another man. General Sumter did not send the 4 men he promised to me, but that I presume must have been owing to some accidental circumstances previous to his affair with Major Fraser, and as that meeting has prevented his doing it at present, it appears to me equitable that you should return us what prisoners you have, till we have 6 men for those I delivered to his flag. The men we took from him, all but 1 or 2 were badly hurt. I must therefore request of you that number. Those 2 you took the other day you can send us immediately, and the others as soon as you can conveniently." Did you follow any of that? Me either. I read this thing about 4 or 5 times trying to figure out what it's saying, what the actual process of this exchange is going to be. But it's indicative of the point we've come to where, again, you just cannot trust the other guy to do what he says, and so there's all these forms of collateral going on. In addition, all these American armies are operating independently of each other. Watson sort of assumes that Marion and Sumter are working within the same organization, which is, of course, a mistake. since the two barely speak to each other, and by the end of the war they will hate each other. But all of this complexity is essentially designed to discourage the other side from pulling a double cross, exactly like each of them had done in the past. So finally, Marion, remember he's got 60 prisoners he wants to unload. He finally agrees to release 6 of them into the British lines. And he writes them a pass to pass into British lines via Nelson's Ferry, right? So this thing's finally going to go through. Nelson's Ferry is kind of out of the way, though. And Watson writes him back that it would be cruel to make these injured men walk all the way around to Nelson's Ferry, and can he please send them a pass by Murray's Ferry instead. So this is sort of where the negotiation breaks down, and this prisoner exchange never happens. They never quite get to the point where they can make it work. And so I call back to that thing that happened earlier this week between Hamas and the Israeli government. And this guy that's been held for 5 years in captivity, he was originally kidnapped as a way to get Palestinian prisoners. I mean, his entire purpose was to be exchanged. So why wasn't he exchanged 5 years ago? And you can start to see why this is happening. We don't know what went on in these secret meetings. We do know that they were close to an agreement several times in the past 5 years. But they're dealing with many of the same issues, right? Disagreement over who's a combatant and who's a criminal. It's a blurry line in these kinds of non-traditional conflicts. There's confusion about command structures and who has the authority. Each side is appealing to fairness and accusing the other side of violating that. There's also logistical problems of how to get people where they need to be. Each side is threatening acts of retaliation based on their different conceptions of the parity that's happening or not happening. And really, at the root of it all, there's this rampant mistrust between the sides that you see in both cases. So at the end of the day, the really remarkable thing about this is not that it took 5 years, but that it happened at all. I think this is more the model that you see in these kinds of situations. So I want to go ahead and open it up for questions. Anybody have anything? Yeah.
What about Isaac Hayes? I mean, the whole deal was that the British had required them to fight on their side after they gave them parole.
Right.
And so that violated the terms, so they felt like they had the right to come on.
Well, the issue with Hayne, if I remember correctly, and somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that the issue with Hayne was that he believed his parole only applied while he was living within British-controlled territory. Is that correct? And that once the Americans had reconquered the territory he was in, he felt released from his parole. And the British thought differently. So, you know, these paroles are it's kind of fuzzy ground. Yeah.
Well, Clinton had double-crossed the parolees very early on, because before he left for New York, he changed the rules.
He did, yeah.
And I would think, if I were a parolee at that point, I'd think, well, he's changed the rules, so my parole's no longer binding.
Right, and many of them did.
Yeah.
Many people, I don't know, Dave, do you know why Postel went back into the service?
I do.
You do?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons. One is the one that was alluded to by Chris, and that is that Clinton said, the war's over, everything's forgiven,
Right.
Your paroles are at an end, you're now good British subjects, show up for duty in the British Army.
Right.
And that's actually how Marion's Brigade gets started. The guys from Williamsburg sent a emissary down to Georgetown to say, what does this mean? And they were told it means you got to show up and serve in the British Army. And they assumed that because of that, that's not what they signed their parole for. Their parole was released. And then you had Weems going up through these areas where these guys lived and burnt everything.
Right.
And they assumed if you burn my house down, you just violated the parole, and I'm released. So it was the combination of the two.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, Jim.
Yeah, I just want to clarify that about Clinton's proclamation. Clinton's proclamation actually doesn't state, it says that they're restored to their full rights and privileges as British subjects. And the implication many people took from that was that they would be required to fight. In fact, if you look at correspondence between Clinton and Cornwallis before Clinton leaves, both Clinton and Cornwallis are very clear that they do not want anybody in the Loyalist militia who does not want to be there. Nobody's going to be coerced to fight against their former friends and neighbors if they don't want to. But because citizenship or being a subject again implies that service, many of the Whigs fear this, and people in more prominent positions capitalize on this. As they see, they're trying to make you fight against various, but it's more a spin that is put on Clinton's proclamation and the perception of it, rather than what Clinton or Cornwallis actually intended. In fact, they repeatedly told Loyalist militia officers when they appointed them, their own subordinates, do not take anyone into the militia who does not want to be there. We want to make sure our followers are loyal. So I just want to clarify.
Right. So again, I mean, all of this is going back to misunderstanding and disagreement about what things mean, and it causes all kinds of problems. In a situation where both sides might be well-meaning and might be trying to honor the intent of the agreement, but at the end of the day, we don't agree on what these documents mean. Causes all kinds of problems. Yeah. Anybody else? All right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.